And I don't believe we need to take a roll, but we do need to have a motion to allow Commissioner Saraki to participate via Zoom. So may I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Second?
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye, okay. And do we have any public comment, Rachel?
We have, hi, this is Julie. I see nobody in the public comment for the lobby, and there is nobody connected online.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. And on to item number 3, the action item, if we could approve the minutes of August 16th.
Move approval.
Second?
It's been moved and approved. All of those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay, the minutes are approved. And now on to the information item. First is our state legislative update, and our state advocacy person is right here in person. Ron?
Good morning, Madam Chair, members.
Good morning.
Thank you for, it's great to be back in person, by the way. So I was texting with Brad last night. I'm like, can I come or Zoom? Here we are. So this morning I'd like to present to you, which I think you should have a copy of, your kind of draft legislative priorities for this upcoming session. Some of these are carries over from last year, which are going to always carry over because we're always going to care about transportation, disadvantage dollars and so on. So let me run through them really quick. Number one is to restore transportation disadvantage innovative service development funds. I'm going to make this story really short. Last year, 3 years ago, when the Senate President did the corridors bill, they took $10 million of transportation disadvantage dollars and stuck it over to the corridors funding. Out of that funding, the innovative grant fundings were for transportation disadvantage were being pulled out of those dollars. This past year, the legislature repealed the corridors bill. So because of that, the $10 million, even though it's there, by the way, it's actually sitting there, they don't have the authority to spend it. So because of that, the innovative service development funds relating to the late shift program went away. And so we've already been talking to the governor's office. In fact, I talked to Chris Spencer in the governor's office last week. They know this is an issue. They're prepared, I think, to try to come up with a solution for next year's budget, which kind of fits into this agenda item. But probably more importantly, you should be aware of, they're actually trying to come up with a solution for this year as well, because the way the policy is currently written is, we can spend transportation disadvantage dollars as a transit authority on, as long as it's coming from the Transportation Disadvantage Trust Fund on TNCs, Uber, Lyft, and others. But if it's just normal transportation trust fund dollars, we don't have the authority to do that because you have to start checking a whole bunch of boxes that the TNCs do not do at this point. So, so the first agenda item we would recommend is to restore the transportation disadvantage, the innovative service development funds. Again, I know the governor's office is working on that, which would allow us to restore our late shift program. Number 2 relates to that as well. There's an outdated rule that is 1490 that restricts basically, again, which I just explained, what the DOT can spend current dollars on transit agencies as it relates to TNCs. DOT is currently working on a fix for that. Governor's office is aware of that. Again, I talked to Chris Spencer last week. In the governor's office, they're working on a solution that would allow DOT, hopefully, to be able to spend transportation disadvantage or transportation dollars, regular transportation trust fund dollars on TNCs. That's number 2. So Rule 1490. So even though that's a legislative priority, I'm hoping that's something that will be solved in the next couple of months and not drag on into session. However, I think it's important to have on here because if it does drag on, or more importantly, if they come up with a solution by rulemaking that doesn't really fit to what we need, we then can go in legislatively and maybe recreate a new statute to make sure that, change statutes to make sure that it does allow us to work directly with TNCs. Any questions on 1 or 2? Number 3, we've talked about the last couple of years, the VW settlement. As you all know, there is about approximately $40 million that still needs to be allocated through DEP as a part of the VW settlement. We and other organizations have been working with DEP to have the remaining funds not only go to school buses, as many of you know, the first part of that the DEP settlement funds with VW settlement dollars went mostly to school buses, is actually splitting those between school buses and transit buses as well. It's not a legislative thing, but we've been working closely with DEP. The legislature has given the authority to DEP to spend those dollars. We just want to make sure they get spent in such a way that we have the ability to use them as a transit agency. Number 4, electric infrastructure and vehicle fund. I told Brad this one's a tough one because DOT is not going to want additional funds that are created. However, we have it on the list, I think, for 2 reasons. Is A, there may be an opportunity to use some of the DEP trust fund dollars and dump into this where you can use that as an infrastructure fund, because having it for buses is great, but if you don't have the ability to have infrastructure put in place where the state can help fund it, that's a whole nother story. The number 2 is Senator Brandis last year had filed a bill that related to infrastructure relating to electric vehicles. It was more focused on residential, not commercial, so we're going to try to work with his office to include commercial as a part of that. It could end up being a pilot. It could be end up something where DEP puts dollars into it to help from an infrastructure standpoint. Any questions on VW settlement or the electric infrastructure? State Transportation Trust Fund. Let me talk briefly about 3 different areas. Number 1 is SIS funding. DOT is, and we talked a little bit about this last year, I think. DOT has been working on trying to give more flexibility on SIS funding for local governments and counties to have more flexibility in how to spend those. Today, you have to spend 75% of those funds on road projects. In Pinellas County, that becomes a problem. So it support DOT's proposal to allow additional flexibility in how those funds can be spent. Trying to lower that potentially to 50%, and more importantly, allow that potentially to be used more on transit and potentially on operating as well. So that's something that is important to us. And then also support more funding flexibility on district designated revenues. That's more of local revenues that could be spent on local projects or local city and county roads. So again, DOT is currently working on a proposal. We've been talking to DOT. In fact, I'm working with Brad and Cassandra and setting up a meeting with DOT to see how we can support those 2 issues. And then the last one is Arterial Program, which again, public transportation investment. Again, this relates to more money assigned to Pinellas County, more specifically, again, that goes into city and county roads as well. I think, Brad, is that the one for the Arterial Program? I don't know if you want to speak to that one.
Yes, this is the one that Ford Pinellas Whitland has spoken that theoretically Pinellas won't be able to spend the money allocated to it.
Okay. A, B, and C are already things that DOT is working on, Madam Chair, so those are things we want to support and help get those to the finish line. Some of those they will not need to do legislatively, but some of them they may have to do legislatively, so we'll be there to support them if we can. Number 6 is pre-award authority of DOT grants. As you all of you know today, when we get a grant from DOT, we cannot start spending those dollars until A, it's awarded, and more importantly, if it's within that fiscal year. And so what we're trying to do is what the federal government allows us to do is allow some pre-award authority where, let's say the grant goes into effect on July the 1st, but there are things we could start spending some of those dollars on prior to July the 1st. As long as we get pre-authority from DOT to spend those dollars, that would allow us to spend those dollars out of that pot on, it could be, design work, it could be, some PD&E, whatever it may be. I know that's something that I think DOT is interested in potentially doing, and more importantly, it does mirror what the federal government already allows us to do. So I think that's something that is a really, really good ask of DOT this year. Because we've talked a lot about over the last year because of COVID is allowing local governments more flexibility on getting these dollars, and more importantly, how and when to spend those dollars, and this kind of fits into that. Number 7 is Medicaid. We've been talking about this for 2 years, working with ACA on what Medicaid eligible trips can be appropriately provided. As you all know, with our current paratransit program, there are many trips today that we're doing that really should be through Medicaid. And we don't have the ability to get reimbursed for that. And so having a conversation with ACA on, is there a way for us, not necessarily to have access to their database, because I know they're not going to want to give us access to the database, but if we know there are eligible trips that should be reimbursed, to work on a system how we could submit for reimbursement from them. We're on our 3rd ACA secretary, since we've had this conversation. So we're going to meet with the new ACA secretary in October and have this conversation. And the last one that's on the list is ferry service. Basically, we just want to make sure that ferry service can be designated as an eligible transit-related project. Today, at the state level, even though it's at the federal level, ferry is not designated as a transit project. We want to make sure that DOT would recognize any ferry projects we're currently working on as a transit project. That's just basically changing the definition to ensure that ferry service is included. Questions, comments?
From the committee, any questions, any comments? Gina? Go ahead.
Thank you. Could you, just to step back, could you explain again, I'm just trying to make sure I understand the differences with the section on state transportation funding flexibility?
Yes, and I'm probably going to need Cassandra and Brad to help me here. So
Yeah,
sis,
the one I'm not sure about was the Ddr funding flexibility. Could you explain how that one's different?
Cassandra, I don't know if you could possibly help me on that one, please.
Sure. Right now, the district gets a pot of funding that is allowed to be put on projects. Those projects are programmed by the MPO, so they have to be on the MPO priority list. The department is seeking to look at ways to put those monies into transit if that is the preference of the area, of the county, and of the MPO. And so in this particular case, we have asked for district designated revenues to go to the operations of the Sunrunner project. And so over the past couple of years, we've been working with the local DOT staff, and they've been working also at central office to make this policy allow us to have a 5-year commitment from the Florida Department of Transportation to projects like the Sunrunner and specifically to operations. It is a different formula than what they've looked at for service development grants. But it is something that would give us additional dollars to transit projects if the policy goes through. Right now, the policy is written that just has not been signed by the DOT secretary. And so what we're requesting here is that he go ahead and sign that. And if we need to put pressure on him to sign that new policy to put it in place and allow the districts to determine their own destiny in terms of how these funds are spent.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
And that kind of goes along with DOT's been talking about the last couple of years, is looking for additional ways to fund transit. And I think this is one step towards that. Remember, there was some talk by Brad Thoburn and others in Tallahassee to potentially create another pot of money that could be used for transit from an operating standpoint. I think this is kind of the first step towards that. It's not its own separate fund, but I think it gives more flexibility to be able to have local governments do that.
Right, and it wouldn't just be for capital projects, but for operations.
That's correct.
It could be, yeah, which is great.
Yeah, it really is.
It does, I would say it does shift the focus of the funds from a local perspective. So we as Pinellas County would be making the decision to fund more public transportation and potentially less roadways. And I think this fits in with where we are as a county and the capacity issues that we have in the county right now. And so it doesn't necessarily mean more money, it does mean more flexibility. And in the outer years, this is where we can make sure that Pinellas continues to get his fair share if there is that flexibility to spend on public transportation and not just roadways.
Is that it, Gina?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Anything from you, Counselor?
No, ma'am, thank you.
Well, I'm sure it won't surprise you. I have a lot of, not necessarily questions, more comments. First of all, are we talking here today about our legislative priorities that we want to see changes in statutes? That's why we're here, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
So I see a lot of inconsistencies here with regard to how we're moving forward, because if we're talking about changing policy, which I think this conversation with Gina and Cassandra just was, that's not a legislative priority. And I've had several conversations myself personally with Secretary Gwynn And it seems to me that some of this could better be handled by building, I know we have a good relationship with him, but we already know, for example, Ron, number 7 on my list is ferry service and designated funding source for waterborne passenger ferry service. I mean, unless I put my head in the sand, I thought I heard the legislative leadership really take a gigantuan step for them by recognizing, yeah, we do have a problem with climate, we do have to take it seriously, we do have to focus on resiliency and sustainability, and if my memory serves me correctly, that was all part of Speaker Sproul's first big speech at the beginning of session when he took over as speaker. Do you remember that?
Yes, ma'am, but
But there is no but. Electric infrastructure, I heard you say the legislature is not going to be inclined to create an electric vehicle and infrastructure funding program. Well, for crying out loud, if you're saying it's a big priority for the state, if you know there are big federal funds that will come down if we're focused on this issue, why in the world would we not focus on making sure that a pot of our money was for electrical vehicle and waterborne transportation? And according to my conversations with Secretary Gwynn, there are dollars that are targeted to change waterborne transportation from diesel to electric. And if I've got that wrong, that's a really huge faux pas, because we're moving forward not only at the county level, but at MPO to really push for all of the ferry services that get public dollars. And by that, I'm talking as a county commissioner, because we have to make a decision here very shortly on whether or not we're going to support the Cross Bay Ferry. And we're not going to support it if we're not going to have a program in place that changes that diesel boat or ship or whatever you call it, ferry, to electric.
Madam Chair, so multiple comments. Number one is changing the ferry from diesel to electric. We actually sent Brad something on Friday about a grant program from the federal government that's flowing through DEP today for exactly that. So hear you on that. Number two is ferry services on here, Madam Chair, because today, the way the current statute's written today, it cannot be designated as fixed route public transportation. By making that one slight change, additional dollars could be opened up to fund that exact project. That's all that we're saying we're trying to do, is to ensure that the fixed route ferry service could qualify as a transit option. Today, the way it's currently written, it cannot. It's
Then why
recognized.
did you say the legislature wouldn't be amenable to creating?
No, that was something, that was back on electric infrastructure. And what I'm saying on electric infrastructure is creating a separate new pot of money could be a challenge. But now what they could do is put DEP dollars into that pot to be able to do that. This is something that Senator Brandis is working on. We're going to work with him. It did not pass last year, but we'll work with him. But his bill last year focused more on just cars. We want to make sure that if it's cars, but it also includes an opportunity for commercial as well. Even if it's just a pilot, we could just pilot it just in Pinellas County.
Yeah, but you can't say on one, do you hear the inconsistency here? Because you cannot say on one hand, we want to change the fuel supply to run these things if you don't have the infrastructure in place to support it. So you can't be for one and not be for the other. It's inconsistent.
I don't know how I'm being inconsistent, Madam Chair. I'm just telling you what I think the landscape in Tallahassee is.
Well, we all know what the landscape is, but that's what you pay for. What we pay you for is to change it. If I thought it was easy, well, then what are we all working so hard for? We've been working on this issue for 50 years. So this isn't, my comments aren't focused on you. It's focused on the great big everybody.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
perhaps, I mean, your point is well taken. Obviously, we would love it if what we were proposing was a direct electric transit bus vehicle fund that they would create to support their own strategic plan goal of 25% of the vehicles, et cetera, match the federal funds, as you say. And on the ferry, it would be great to create a brand-new ferry boat fund for electric infrastructure, more sustainable infrastructure. But, you know, this is just sort of like the philosophy or the strategy about whether or not we should just throw them out there and then probably have them rejected, or maybe we can do some creative thinking about these, like I think Ron has just described on the electric vehicles. Start off, there is funding that's already available from the VW settlement. Could that be seed money to go into this fund? Senator Brandis seems to be supportive of such a kind of initiative.
I get all that, Brad. I just think we have to be careful about our messages, because when you start off by saying the legislature is unlikely to support, and, you know, we're not asking for a new funding source. I get that. We're trying to have more flexibility in what we already have. And if they just get out of our way and let the local governments determine what is the best option for our own geographical area, instead of trying to lay a blanket over the whole entire state, it seems to me we'd be a lot better off. So that leads me to say, what would you think about the idea of picking out a couple of these things and putting them into a local bill that was specific to Tampa Bay or Pinellas County?
I'm not sure what from here would fit as a local bill, because most of the changes we're talking would be more statewide changes. I think we would need authority to be able to do that.
You mean the ferry?
Yes, the
Oh,
Clearwater
well,
one.
although there are other areas of the state that are very supportive of ferries as well.
But do they have one? We have one that we're trying to expand.
We actually have two, including the Crosby, and the
Well,
Clearwater.
but that's regional, so that would be over on the T-Barta side. I'm just saying, I'm trying to think of every option because,
Well, I think the ferry option, Madam Chair, is actually one of the easier lifts on here, because it's just working with DOT as a part of their package to include that ferry service would be recognized as fixed transit, basically,
so maybe if we sneak it into the big transportation package, nobody will pay attention to it.
Well, and obviously we'd want DOT to support it. Our goal would be on many of these items is to work directly with DOT, not only with Secretary Gwynn, but also Secretary Tebow. So, you know, our goal would be to have you approve this and have us then sit down with DOT to talk about, okay, here's our agenda. Are there things that could be included as a DOT trust fund? There's certain things that are moving through the process within rulemaking. There's certain things that DOT is already working on from a policy standpoint. So I think there's some early ones we're going to get on some of these items even prior to session, but I think it's important for us as PSTA to be very involved and active on these items.
So if I could just jump in on the ferry discussion, Madam Chair, if it's all right with you.
Hold on, Cassandra, because Counselor Driscoll has a question.
Okay.
Yeah,
Comment.
and yeah, if you don't mind, Cassandra, I wanted just to clarify. So what I'm thinking is by making a change to that definition to include ferry service as fixed route public transportation, if ferry service is in that category, then that potentially could open up or the flexibility to include ferry service in projects such as those that convert to electric.
Yeah.
If not now, then later.
That's
So it kind of all goes together, but by changing that definition, it just opens us up to a lot of, great potential to not only keep the ferry service going, but to expand and expand it and make it more environmentally friendly in the long run.
So Ron, would it be, not to do wordsmithing here, But if we just took the sentence, designate funding source for waterborne passenger ferry service, and then take out that not looking for new money, why can't we just say, confirm ferry service is eligible as fixed route public transportation, and just leave it at that?
Absolutely, yeah, and again, we have no pride of authorship here, so whatever that you all want to change,
Well,
absolutely.
I think, the simpler you can make your ask and the less complicated, the better off you're going to be.
And we're already working with Cassandra on, each of these will have their own separate white paper, by the way, so once and that's kind of, we're getting into next steps, but what we'll do is, once you all approve it, the board approves it is, we'll actually have a one-pager on that specifically kind of outlining what the need is and why it's important to PSTA.
Okay,
I think Cassandra had a,
Brad, Cassandra, you must speak, I'm sure.
It's okay. Right now, the Florida Department of Transportation is not really funding ferry service. The Cross Bay Ferry did get a service development grant, but understand that that is competing with other public transportation across the state. I think the long-term goal would be to create a funding program that does not exist right now. The short term is to make sure that they understand that we are pursuing a ferry program and that we will be applying for state funding to support our ferry services. The long-term goal really would be to create a new program that would allow for the state to fund ferry services, understanding that we may be one of the early users of that program because the other parts of the state have not pursued a lot of ferry services because of the lack of support from the Florida Department of Transportation. And so I think this is a multi-step process to get our projects funded. And to your point about electrification, I think that that is definitely something that we could work into our conversation.
Brad?
yeah. I don't want to also forget your initial comment that a number of these items are more policy related. And I agree with you, they are better, more strategically addressed through conversations with Secretary Gwen and Secretary Secretary Tebow. So it is just sort of how I'm open to any ideas anyone has on how we present this. Present them to our legislators, to the audience of the legislators, probably in a different way than you see them on this piece of paper, because there's really nothing directly that we're asking the legislators to do. Perhaps, like we employed in the past, a strategy of having the legislators write letters of support to the Secretary of Transportation in support of some of these policies. I don't think that hurts, and the legislators seem to be very open to doing that, doing those kinds of things. Just kind of, the focus is still on the DOT. The focus is the policies are in the works. I don't think it hurts anything to have the legislators, just nudge it a little bit.
Madam Chair, I think, of the 8, I think there's 4 that's going to require some type of legislative approval. Number 1, the restore the, the service development funds for the late shift program will require not only funding for that, but then more importantly, if it's specifically specific dollars for the innovative program for TD. I know the governor's office is most likely going to recommend that, but we need to stay ahead of that, obviously. Number 2, the Rule 1490. We've been working on that with DOT for 2 years, Brad and Cassandra,
Yeah.
maybe longer. At some point, we may just have to change it, from a legislative standpoint. So I think that could require a policy change. And we may want to change it from a policy standpoint, because the one thing about rules is rules could always be changed. So it may just be best to go back in and make sure that it's very specific. The intent of the legislature is to allow TNCs and transit agencies to be able to work together and spend state dollars. Number 6, the pre-award authority of DOT grants would definitely require legislative authority. That's not something that DOT can probably just wave a wand on. So I think that is a specific policy change of the legislature. The number 8,
So,
the ferry
Yep,
services.
on number 6, that is not a DOT issue as much as it is a Department of Financial Services issue, and a cash flow issue that, and to your point, Ron, it is very much an issue that we will need state legislators to weigh in on and help us with. That is an extreme amount of flexibility that we would be able to have in the work program from the DOT. But ultimately, it is not a DOT policy that they're following.
So that's what I'm interested in, is our top 4, because we are here to establish our legislative priorities. And
Yeah.
all of the rest of this stuff are policy issues that we can really work on a year-round basis. Is that not correct, Ron?
That would be correct. I would include, maybe like you said, here's your top 4 legislative, 3 or 4 legislative priorities that have other issues, maybe are issues that we're working on from a policy standpoint. But we should at least let our legislative delegation know they're out there, but let them know we don't need any action from them at this time, but it could require them to weigh in at some point.
And have we started meeting with our state legislators?
Madam Chair, we're going to do that that's at the end. We're going to talk about is we're planning a couple of trips to Tallahassee. The committee weeks start, as you know, the week of September the 20th. We're recommending doing 1 trip during committee weeks in October or November, and then doing 1 trip early on in session as well. I think the 2 weeks have played out very well for us in the past, and so like we've done in the past is have Brad and a couple of board members come up and meet with members while we're in Tallahassee. In addition to doing some of those meetings in Tallahassee, obviously we'll do meetings back home as well.
And have you heard any news from the leadership about how they're going to handle meetings in Tallahassee this year? Because remember last year it was just
Yeah, not yet, Madam Chair. Right now, we expect the Capitol's open today. We expect the Capitol to be fully open come September. The House
For
and
the
Senate.
public?
Yes, ma'am, to the public. We have not heard any indication from the House or Senate, any restrictions at this point. I know that Representative Renner from the Jacksonville area is being designated as the next speaker during that week, so they're expecting a lot of people in the Capitol because of that. So we don't believe there'll be any restrictions at this time.
Can I add that City of Largo had a legislative roundtable with Senator Brandis and Rep. Lala yesterday, and they both expressed that as well, that they believe the Capitol on both sides will be open this session.
Oh, well, that'll help prepare for our visit.
Amen.
Commissioner Saraki, did you have any comments or questions that you wanted to weigh in on? I almost forgot you've been so quiet.
No, Madam Chair, I'm fine. Thank you.
Okay.
Madam Chair, what I would recommend is if you all could approve conceptually what this looks like, then maybe us present back to the full board. I think what I heard you say, and Brad and Cassandra, correct me if I'm wrong here, but maybe some version of 1, 2, 6, and 8 from a legislative agenda standpoint that are policy changes, and then 4, well, actually, we probably want to include 4 as well, the electric infrastructure, just because, so probably there would end up being 5, Madam Chair, but the electric infrastructure one, because there may be a bill out there, so we may want to try to impact that legislation. So maybe 1, 2, 4, 6, and 8, and then 3, 5, and 7 would be other issues that we're working on from a policy standpoint to work directly with DOT or other agencies.
Okay. Is that okay with the rest of the group? Gina?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Anything else, Ron?
Now, like I said, we'll work with Brad and Cassandra on start developing white papers based upon this. And then number 2 is we'll go ahead and we'll lock down some dates, Brad, that works with your calendar to get you, maybe a few board members to Tallahassee during either October. I think Caitlin emailed you yesterday the dates. If you just want to look at October, November, pick one of those weeks, then maybe session starts on January the 11th, maybe in week 2, sometime in early January, have you come up as well.
Great. So, Madam Chair, I sort of apologize. I left this as an informational item today with the idea that, well, we could come back at I think it's October 3rd Legislative Committee meeting, and take a vote to recommend it to the board, but then not approve it till the end of October PSDA board meeting. But then some of us will go to Tallahassee and advocate for something that hasn't really been totally approved by the board.
Right.
So if you all feel comfortable with this approach, as Ron just described it, if you feel the desire as a legislative committee to make a recommendation to the board so we could take it to the September meeting and then go to Tallahassee at one of these weeks in October, that probably would be better.
Well, that's fine with me. Anybody have any objections?
No,
Do you, Jamie?
No, I agree.
Dan? Do you have any objections?
No, I don't, Madam Chair.
Are you planning on being at our next meeting?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay,
You can come to the PSDA board meeting?
Yep.
Okay, good.
good. Excellent. Okay, are we done now with the state piece? You're finished, Ron?
Yes, ma'am.
Cassandra, do you have any more input? Okay, well, Harry, it's your turn.
Yeah. So we're going to put up a few slides here real quick. I'll read this one. Thank you. Well, good morning, Commissioners. Madam Chair, Commissioners, great to be with you in person again. I echo what Ron said. It's nice to see everybody's face. Steve and I are here. Steve's over my shoulder. I think you can see Steve up here over my shoulder. We just wanted to give you a quick update on, this is kind of a down period for Congress this month of August. The House and Senate are currently in recess until the middle of September. And we've got a couple legislative items kind of dual tracking here. I wanted to try and just answer any questions you have about it. I think Steve and I have presented, I think, at various times at previous meetings, the details of what's in the regular appropriations bills for transportation and in the bipartisan infrastructure bill for transportation. You already talked about some of the items during Ron's presentation, additional money for ferry grants, electric vehicles, electric buses, all of that is additional money that's in both of these bills. So Steve and I thought we'd just kind of clarify the difference between the two bills, the status of these bills, and what the outlook is for September and beyond to help you plan. First of all, I'll cover the transportation. As you know, Congress every year has to pass 12 annual appropriations bills for all the departments of the federal government. The bill of most interest to you is the Transportation Appropriations Bill. This is a bill that continues to fund things like the ferry boat program, the no emission bus program, some of the funding for the CIG program, Construction Infrastructure Grant Program, is all included in there, as well as funds for the larger discretionary grant programs like the RAISE grant program. So Congress, the House approved its fiscal year 2022 appropriations bill on July 29th. It was included with a package of other bills. Right now, the Senate is on hold. They've passed 3 individual appropriations bills, but have no schedule yet for the other 9, including the transportation bill. We expect to see that come forward at some time in late September or maybe October. As you know, the federal fiscal year begins on October 1st, so Congress is going to have to pass some type of a continuing resolution, funding resolution, to keep the government operating as has become usual practice into the new fiscal year. They'll have to do that sometime between now and September 30th, or else the government will shut down. Nobody wants that to happen. One of the good news items in this regular appropriations process, as we've reported before, is that your Congressman Christ has included in this transportation appropriations bill $1.2 million for the purchase and installation of 2 WAVE on-route induction electric bus charger systems. I believe, Brad, one for St. Petersburg and one for Clearwater. This is a good project. As you know, Congress, for the first time in 10 years, has brought back what used to be called congressional earmarks, now called congressionally directed funding, to allow members of Congress to provide support for specific funding requests. So Congressman Chris did a great job here, and what I would report is we hear from the leadership of the House and Senate Appropriations Committee that if you're in the House bill or the Senate bill, and as long as the bill ultimately becomes law, you should be in good shape. So I think the fact that this project is in the House bill, there's low to no risk that the project would be knocked out of in the final negotiations on the bill. The only risk is if Congress doesn't get their appropriations bills done for the full year, if they would operate on a continuing resolution for the entire year, that would put the project at risk, but that's also a low probability. So I think you're in good shape here. Brad, I know the question always is, when will we see the money? We don't think these appropriations bills will become law till the end of the calendar year, end of December, so the earliest you probably see any funding coming out would probably be next spring. And we don't know exactly what the process will be. It's been 11 years since there have been earmarked funding, so there'll have to be, FTA will have to set up a process to get these funds to where they need to go, but we'll continue to work with you on that. I'm going to pass, if I can get this to click, pass back now. Steve, the second bill we're going to talk about here is the bipartisan infrastructure bill, also known as the highway bill. And I'll let Steve talk about that a little bit.
Thank you, Harry, and thank you, Commissioners. I appreciate the opportunity to be here remotely today. I look forward to joining you in person, hopefully soon. Harry mentioned that we have given you some of the background on the bipartisan infrastructure bill. They named the bill, just so you have it, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So the IIJA, you may hear mentioned many times. We've gotten used over the last 6 years to the FAST Act. That's the current Surface Transportation Reauthorization Bill. That expires on September 30th. So where the Senate has passed the bill on August 10th, it was a 69-30 vote, very bipartisan vote. So the bill now is before the House, and there has been some internal dynamics going on about the sequencing of this bill and the next $3.5 trillion bill, which I won't get into today because it's been resolved, but there have been some dynamics in the House about which has caused this bill to be somewhat delayed. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act will be voted on by the House before September 27th. They've reached agreement on doing that. And I think as of today, I feel fairly certain that it will pass. And just as a reminder, it's overall, including current spending, it's $1.2 trillion, not just for transportation, but the majority of that is for transportation infrastructure. Transit funding has continued and actually increased $39 billion over the next 5 years. So there will be a significant increase for PSTA, both in formula and the opportunity to compete for some of the things that Harry and Ron have talked in terms of competitive grants for electric buses and other electric ferries and other programs. The other bill, the one thing, let me just mention, Congressman Christ was again very successful in terms of getting us a $6 million earmark included in the House-passed Invest in America bill. Now, it appears very unlikely that the House-passed Invest in America bill, which is the House version of a 5-year surface transportation bill, will be included at all in this final bill. So the Senate-passed bill is going to be the final bill that will go to the president, assuming it passes the House, which means the $6 million earmark that Congressman Chris got in for solar panels and electric charging infrastructure is at risk. Unless he's successful in doing anything else, attaching those earmarks to another bill, that money will not be included in this $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill. That is the bad news. The good news is there is the $3.5 trillion human infrastructure bill that Congress next will be debating. They're working on that right now. They will start they're drafting that bill. Initially, we didn't think there would be anything related to transit to it, but there's an effort underway by APTA, by the Bus Coalition, by organized labor, by steel manufacturers and other suppliers to try to get another $10 billion in transit included into this $3.5 trillion bill. There was a handshake agreement in the Senate that said basically programs that were funded in the infrastructure bill wouldn't be funded again in the human infrastructure bill. But because they cut in the last days of the negotiations, they reduced transit funding by $10 billion. House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee Chairman Peter DeFazio is fighting hard to try to get that $10 billion reinstated. So he is working on that, and included in that would be the $5.9 billion worth of earmarks, including our $6 million for the solar panel electric charging infrastructure. So there is, while the infrastructure bill we hope will be signed into law, certainly passed the Congress by the end of this month and signed into law shortly thereafter. There is still legislation moving ahead in the House and the Senate where we could have an additional funding for transit, and PSD could benefit from the inclusion of those earmarks. Normally, it's a challenge to include earmarks in this budget reconciliation process. The Senate parliamentarian has knocked out earmarks in the past, saying they violate Senate rules. But I think Chairman DeFazio feels he's got a way to be able to do this that will get around those rules, which remains to be seen. So the good news is he's committed to trying to get these earmarks done in this bill or any other bill that might pass this year as well. So we'll keep working with him and his staff and trying to make sure that that earmark's included in that final legislation, either this bill or the infrastructure bill or later in the year. And with that, Harry, I'll turn it back to you.
So Madam Chair, you'll be interested, one of the things Steve was talking about, trying to add $10 billion in extra money into the big budget reconciliation bill for transit. And one of the ways he's trying to do that, instead of labeling it as a transportation infrastructure, correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, he's trying to label it as climate, way to reduce impact on climate, which would be of interest to you. And so that, and I think your solar project here would dovetail nicely with that. So we'll continue to work on that. But so he's calling it a $10 billion investment in protecting the climate by investing in transit.
I like your messaging, Steve. Good thought. My question to both of you, I guess, on these issues, do we have, since the Senate is poised to, give us a little bit of heartburn, do we have, for instance, Senator Marco inclined to help us, do you think?
I'm sorry, Senator?
Senator Marco Rubio? Rubio, Senator Marco.
Neither Senator Rubio nor Senator Scott asked for or support congressional earmark spending right at this point, so I'm not sure that that's probably where we're going to need to get our help on this. I think right now, Steve's been in touch with Congressman DeFazio's staff. I think they're trying to work through, trying to find a creative solution to include these projects in the reconciliation bill. So I think right now it's a House push with the Senate leadership, correct, Steve, and the Parliament.
Yeah, and thanks, Harry. And Commissioner, one thing I failed to mention is, while the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is a bipartisan bill, that's the $1.2 trillion bill the Senate has passed and the House will pass later this month. The $3.5 trillion human infrastructure bill, you'll hear people talking about that, climate change, human infrastructure, education, childcare, that's where that bill will focus. That is a Democrat-only bill. The Republicans are not going to support that bill. Primarily because there are probably many reasons, but one of the foremost reasons is they don't believe that we need to spend another $3.5 trillion. The final bill may not be that costly, be that high, but as a result of that, Senator Rubio, Senator Scott are not supporting the bill, and it would be a challenge to try to get them to support our earmark in that bill as a result. Plus, as Harry mentioned, they aren't supporting earmarks generally right now.
And one last point on the infrastructure bill, commissioners. We talked about it earlier, but just to give you a quick summary, I think of the bipartisan infrastructure bill as kind of a supercharged supplemental appropriations bill for transportation. So you have your annual appropriations bills that we pass each year. This bill will provide, as Steve said, $1.2 trillion, correct, Steve, over 5 years. And so it's additional money that, in addition to what's in the regular appropriations process. So for instance, it'll provide $8 billion in additional funding for capital investment grant program for FTA programs. So that's in addition to what is provided every year. So it's supercharging those. It provides a program, $2 billion. I know you talked about Medicaid transportation, $2 billion for enhanced mobility for seniors and disabled programs. So there's additional funding for that. It provides $5.25 billion over 5 years for the low-no emission bus program. So that's additional money that you all will be able to compete for. It'll be a larger pot. It provides, Cassandra and I have been talking, $1.25 billion for over 5 years for the ferry boat program. So keep in mind, right now, the ferry boat program is about $30 million a year. So you're talking about $250 million a year in addition for the ferry boat program going forward. And Commissioner, or Chair Long, you mentioned this earlier, there's an additional, on top of that, $250 million new pilot program for electric or low-emission ferry boats. So that'll be an additional $50 million on top of that, specifically for low-emission ferries. So there are some larger, many funding opportunities over 5 years. Every year for 5 years, they'll be having discretionary competitions for these projects. So there'll be lots of additional money out there to help you out. Just finally, just in conclusion, I know we talked before about your the Clearwater Transit Center project. The raise grant application for this project was submitted to FTA before its deadline on July 12th. You all are having a ceremony in the city of Clearwater on September 16th, and part of the strategy that we've been working with Steve and I and Brad have been working together on is following that event on the 16th, working to arrange calls with Secretary Buttigieg to advocate for the program as they, during the fall, get to the final evaluation of the projects going forward. So we'll continue to work with Brad and staff to set that up with Congressman Christ and others that will participate in the call. So, I don't know, Steve, is there anything else you wanted to add on that one?
No, that's good, thanks.
And then finally, I know you have all been working real hard today on the state legislative agenda. We have a meeting scheduled for later in September with Brad to talk about the federal agenda. I think that the idea is to delay a little bit because with the hope that the infrastructure bill could be signed into law sometime in late September, early October. Quite a bit of the work in the new year will be to decide how to implement some of these new programs,
Right, yeah.
and to help shape some of the notice of funding opportunities that come out to make sure that they're written in a way that will be an advantage to PSTA as you compete for those additional funds. So there'll be a lot of work going on into the new year as they look to write the rules and regulations for these new programs. So we're happy to answer any questions. Oh, and if I can add one more thing, I know, Chair, you asked about the access to the Capitol. We're not really sure yet as far as the federal side. Right now, the federal agencies are not taking in-person meetings. They're continue to be closed to the public. The Capitol is open to some limited degree for public meetings. It's much more difficult than it used to be. As you know, once you're in the Capitol, you can access all the House and the Senate and move back and forth. Right now, you have to be escorted from security to an office, back to security, and then you have to be picked up to take to another meeting. So it's a much more difficult process. Some offices are discouraging in-person meetings right now. So I think as far as coming to Washington, we're just going to evaluate that in the fall and see what the security and the public health requirements are up there. Sorry, we're happy to answer questions.
Any questions?
No, ma'am.
Any comments? Commissioner Saraki, you're still with us, right?
I am still here and I am alive.
Do you have any? Well, we're so happy to know that. Do you have any questions or comments?
Nope, I'm fine, Madam Chair. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot, Harry. That was very comprehensive, very interesting. We have a lot to keep our eyes on going forward, that's for sure. So, Brad, do you want to talk, well, we already talked about.
We already talked about this, yeah.
Okay.
So I think,
Do we have other business to discuss?
no, I think we're good.
Anybody?
No, ma'am.
Dan? Commissioner Saraki?
Nope, I have no other business. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay. Counselor Driscoll?
I'm all set, thank you.
Okay. Then, for the sake of everybody, we are adjourned. And thank you, gentlemen, for participating. Happy you were able to.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank
What?
you. Oh, that was Alan.
Oh,
Oh.
gone already.
Okay. Good.
You look even better in person than you do on the screen.
Okay, so next we have